Imagine a single piece of paper, a fragile rectangle of parchment, inked with words so seemingly ordinary that no one could have predicted its impact. And yet this one letter, crafted in quiet deliberation, sent across great distances, and received with unsuspecting eyes, had the power to destabilize the very foundations of an empire. In a world governed by networks of power, information, and human perception, how could such a small artifact trigger the unraveling of a vast social system? To understand this, we must explore not only the historical facts surrounding the letter, but also the underlying dynamics of human cognition, collective behavior, and societal resilience. It is a journey that invites us to examine the fragility and adaptability of empires as reflections of the human brain itself. Just as neurons exchange signals to coordinate thought, so too do the leaders, courtiers, and citizens of an empire exchange information to coordinate society. And sometimes one unexpected signal like this letter can ripple through the system with consequences no one foresaw. The letter in question emerged during a period of profound tension. Empires are often imagined as monolithic entities, yet they are more accurately described as living networks, constantly processing inputs, weighing threats, and recalibrating their responses. Within these networks, stress acts as both a catalyst and a filter. When an empire confronts uncertainty, whether from internal dissent or external invasion, the system enters a state of heightened sensitivity. Just as the human brain under stress prioritizes certain stimuli over others, a society under duress assigns outsized importance to certain messages. A single communication, carefully framed or poorly interpreted, can become the pivot around which entire historical trajectories shift. This letter was precisely such a pivot. The psychological power of written words lies in their ability to bypass immediate sensory reality and influence perception directly. Neuroscience tells us that the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for planning, judgment, and risk assessment, relies on coherent narratives to generate decisions. In a similar manner, an empire relies on the coherence of information flowing through its bureaucratic and social structures. When a key node within this network receives a message that conflicts with its expected narrative, it experiences a form of cognitive dissonance. If the message is sufficiently alarming or contains plausible authority, the dissonance can cascade through connected nodes, producing an emergent social effect analogous to a neural cascade. Leaders pause, councils convene, soldiers hesitate, merchants hedge, and ordinary citizens whisper and speculate. In other words, the perception of reality begins to shift before reality itself has changed. Consider the timing of the letter. It arrived during a moment of strategic uncertainty when the empire's leadership was already primed to overreact. Historical records show that empires often operate under what psychologists call stress-induced narrowing, where decision-makers focus on immediate threats while neglecting broader context. This is akin to the fight-or-flight response in humans, where the amygdala hijacks rational evaluation to protect the organism from perceived danger. The letter, though innocuous in literal terms, was coded with symbols of threat that the system interpreted as existential. In the minds of those in power, every sentence resonated as if it were an alarm bell. The brilliance, or perhaps the tragedy, of this communication was its exploitation of the empire's own cognitive architecture. The sender did not need armies or resources. They leveraged the mechanisms by which information propagates through a system, much as a small electrical pulse can trigger a massive response in a neural network. At the same time, the empire's citizens were not passive recipients of this signal. Collective behavior is an emergent property arising from the aggregation of individual perceptions, biases, and heuristics. Humans are wired to detect patterns, particularly in social hierarchies. When rumors or official missives suggest that norms are threatened, people instinctively scan their environment for corroborating evidence. The letter created a subtle feedback loop. Officials reacted to the perceived threat. Citizens observed the officials' reactions, and their combined behaviors amplified the signal, feeding it back into the system with increasing intensity. Historians sometimes describe this as a tipping point, yet it's more instructive to consider it as a resonance phenomenon. Just as a single frequency can resonate with a bridge until it shudders, a single message can resonate with the latent anxieties of an empire until it begins to tremble. Philosophically, this incident illuminates a recurring paradox. What appears weak or trivial in isolation can, under the right circumstances, wield immense power. The letter itself was paper and ink, yet its influence transcended its materiality. This is analogous to the role of neurotransmitters in the brain. The molecules themselves are minuscule, but their coordinated effects shape consciousness. Similarly, an empire's strength is not measured solely by its armies or resources, but by the coherence and adaptability of its information systems. When a carefully constructed signal finds a system already primed by uncertainty, it can reshape behavior as dramatically as any military campaign. As the letter circulated, the empire exhibited patterns familiar to cognitive scientists. Initially, the response was localized. Certain courts or regions interpreted the message as a warning, issuing orders or modifying routines. Soon, however, the influence diffused more broadly, manifesting as hesitation, miscommunication, and ultimately institutional paralysis. This diffusion mirrors the way a neuronal signal propagates through a network. It is initially constrained to a few pathways, but eventually engages the entire system, eliciting complex, often unpredictable responses. In human societies, such cascades are rarely linear. Small perturbations interact with existing stressors, producing nonlinear effects that historians retrospectively label as collapse, reform, or revolution. The letter's power lay precisely in its capacity to exploit these nonlinearities. One might ask, why did this particular letter have such a pronounced effect while countless other communications were ignored or forgotten? The answer lies at the intersection of credibility, timing, and system vulnerability. The sender understood not only the political landscape, but also the cognitive susceptibilities of those in power. In neuropsychological terms, they engaged the prefrontal cortex while bypassing rational filters, triggering emotional and heuristic responses. They anticipated which narratives would resonate, which doubts would amplify anxiety, and which institutional routines would magnify uncertainty. It was not magic or luck. It was a sophisticated manipulation of perception. This perspective invites a reconsideration of historical causality. Often historians emphasize armies, treaties, or economic trends. Yet the dynamics of attention, belief, and expectation play an equally critical role. Empires, after all, are not merely collections of people and resources. They are collective cognitive systems. The unfolding events following the letter reveal the subtle interplay between adaptation and rigidity. The empire, confronted with conflicting signals, attempted to stabilize itself through traditional hierarchies and procedural responses. Yet rigidity, especially under stress, often reduces resilience. The cognitive equivalent in humans is functional fixedness. Familiar problem-solving strategies fail under novel pressures. By contrast, adaptive systems recognize uncertainty, redistribute resources, and integrate diverse inputs. The letter exposed precisely where the empire's rigidity outweighed its adaptability. Some regions responded creatively, mitigating localized threats, while others locked into maladaptive patterns that accelerated systemic destabilization. In this light, the letter was both a diagnostic tool and an agent of change, revealing the empire's cognitive architecture and exploiting its vulnerabilities. From a sociological standpoint, this episode illustrates distributed cognition, knowledge and decision-making dispersed across networks of officials, advisors, and citizens. The letter acted as a signal that perturbed these networks, forcing realignment. Cognitive science demonstrates that distributed systems can be remarkably robust, yet they are also sensitive to signals that synchronize nodes in unexpected ways. The historical consequence was a cascade of adjustments, each minor individually, yet collectively capable of redirecting the trajectory of an empire. It is here that history converges with neuroscience. Both domains reveal how complex systems respond to perturbations, how small inputs can have outsized consequences, and how perception often precedes action. The philosophical implications are equally profound. If a letter, a symbol of human intention and communication, can reshape an empire overnight, what does this say about the nature of power and knowledge? Power is not merely force. It is attention, interpretation, and the capacity to influence perception. Knowledge is not merely information. It is the structured integration of signals that allows a system to navigate uncertainty. The letter reminds us that history is not deterministic but contingent, emergent, and sensitive to the quality of communication and perception. It challenges the notion of inevitability in historical processes and encourages reflection on the subtle levers that guide collective human behavior. Even today, the incident offers insights for modern systems thinking. In corporations, governments, and digital networks, small perturbations, an email, a tweet, a policy memo can trigger disproportionate effects. If the system is highly connected and primed for uncertainty, stress amplifies sensitivity, heuristics bias perception, and feedback loops magnify small signals. Understanding these dynamics is not merely academic. It is essential for designing resilient institutions, predicting cascading failures, and appreciating the human factors that underlie organizational outcomes. The past, in this case, functions as both cautionary tale and laboratory for systemic analysis, teaching lessons that transcend centuries. Yet, amidst this narrative, we encounter a surprising twist. The letter, which initially appeared to weaken the empire, may in fact have contributed to its long-term survival. By exposing latent vulnerabilities, triggering internal recalibration, and forcing adaptation, it accelerated processes that might otherwise have taken decades to manifest. Neuroscience often shows that stress, when not lethal, strengthens neural circuits through learning and adaptation. Similarly, historical stressors, including shocks like this letter, can enhance societal resilience by forcing reorganization, improving communication pathways, and eliminating complacency. In other words, what seems like a destabilizing blow in the short term can act as a mechanism for long-term stability. This paradox, apparent weakness fostering robustness, is a recurring motif in both biological and social systems. The letter also underscores the role of human cognition in history. Empires do not collapse simply because of material insufficiency. They fail when their collective perception of reality becomes misaligned with actual conditions. Cognitive bias, overconfidence, and selective attention can amplify trivial signals or ignore critical warnings. Conversely, the capacity to interpret signals accurately, integrate diverse inputs, and adapt dynamically can transform crises into opportunities. The letter thus becomes a lens for exploring the intersection of psychology, sociology, and historical causality. It illustrates that history is not merely a sequence of events, but a complex interplay of perception, decision-making, and collective cognition. Ultimately, the story of the letter invites reflection on the fragile beauty of human systems. Each society is a living network, each individual a node, each decision a signal that may propagate unpredictably. Just as the brain thrives on both stability and plasticity, societies flourish when they balance tradition with adaptability. The letter reminds us that small actions, carefully timed and cognitively attuned, can resonate far beyond their immediate context. It challenges us to recognize the profound significance of communication, perception, and attention in shaping our collective destiny. In contemplating this historical episode, we also confront timeless philosophical questions. To what extent are we masters of our institutions? How do tiny perturbations shape the trajectory of civilizations? And how can understanding these dynamics enhance our capacity to navigate an uncertain world? History, neuroscience, and philosophy converge in this narrative to reveal that the most ordinary objects, a letter, a note, a message, can wield extraordinary influence. The empire changed not merely because of military defeat or economic collapse, but because of a single, carefully calibrated signal that exploited the vulnerabilities inherent in complex human systems. It demonstrates that information, perception, and cognition are as potent as armies and gold in shaping the course of history. And it invites us to consider our own modern networks, digital, social, political, through the same lens, appreciating both their fragility and their remarkable capacity for adaptation. So, as we close this reflection on the letter that changed an empire overnight, consider your own environment as a living network. Every message you send, every action you take, is a signal that propagates through a complex system of relationships, beliefs, and perceptions. Small interventions, when aligned with systemic sensitivities, can produce outcomes far beyond what intuition might suggest. And just as the empire ultimately adapted, our modern societies and ourselves are capable of harnessing awareness, reflection, and strategic insight to navigate uncertainty. If this story has sparked your curiosity about the subtle forces that shape history, the intersection of psychology and society, and the ways in which perception drives outcomes, then engage with this conversation further. Leave a comment with your thoughts on how small actions can produce outsized effects. Share this video to expand the dialogue. Like it if it expanded your perspective, and subscribe to Past Lens for more journeys into the hidden dynamics of history. After all, every story, like every signal, has the potential to change the network of our understanding, sometimes overnight.